Welcome. We are going to do a cute bear cub today with watercolor. I'm Viv with Art with Viv, and welcome to Monday's Mini. Let's just jump in. Already sketched him out. This is a 5x7 piece of paper, watercolor paper, 140 pound. Sketched him out. I'm getting some different shades of brown out on my palette. We're going to go in with the lighter shade first. And I'm going straight on to dry paper. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to map out the lights and the darks, just the undertones of his fur. I'm not trying to get any detail in. I'm just trying to get in where some shadows and some light are. So I am taking two different, I'm taking a really dark brown and a really light brown and putting those in the places where I see some shadows and highlights. And I'm going to let you watch, and I will be right back. So really the main thing you want to worry about on this underpainting is getting the shapes of the shadows correct and putting them in the right spot. We're just doing the really dark shadows and the really light shadows. It's the ugly stage of the painting. It's okay. It's going to be okay. I promise you, just keep going. Once you get these shapes and shadows down right now, we are going to let this dry. And we will move on to his eyes next. So just be sure that you are trying to get in those correct shapes in the right spot. So we've let him dry. I'm getting a little Payne's gray, a little bit of burnt umber, just some darker colors mixed together. And we're going to just work in his eye. He has got a really dark sort of shadow around the outside of his eye. I'm taking a little bit of water and I'm just coming in there and just blending out that darker color in toward the center. I'm going to leave a little bit of the white of the paper for the highlight. This is just the cutest little bear cub, so we're going to do the same thing to the other eye. We're just outlining it with this dark mixture we have here. You can use black if you would like. Black sometimes tends to look a little bit flat, so I've used a mixture here. So just use whatever you have on your palette. This is just a practice. It's just a quick little Monday morning mini, and it's just something to get you started, get your creativity flowing. So don't get too what am I trying to say? Just don't get too frou-frou with it. Also going to come in with this dark mixture and paint in his nostrils. Now remember, we let that light and dark brown dry completely before we started this. We didn't want it to bleed together. And if you're enjoying this, please subscribe. Below, hit the notification bell so that you won't miss any videos. And that will help me be able to make more content and get this out to people who would really enjoy it. All right, now I'm just taking up more of a red brown, and I'm kind of just doing a light glaze over his forehead And we're just going to be building up glazes as we go. I've switched brushes. I've switched from my bigger brush to my smaller detail brush, and I'm just going to put in some like hairlines, just some texture of the fur into these darker areas so that he looks fuzzy. And I'm trying to preserve that lighter brown. I'm not going to go all the way into that lighter brown. I'm just doing some texture marks into the darker shadow areas and creating a few more shapes with this little hairline technique, just making these little hairlines. And I'm going to let you watch, and I will return just in a second. Now I'm just mixed up a really dark brown, and I'm going to come in here, and this is really the darkest shadow is on this side of his face. So I'm just going to sort of just do hash marks. I call them hash marks. Just little fur brush strokes to indicate fur. I'm not getting too neat with it. It's just sort of a random splash of this dark brown. I am trying to make sure that my brush strokes go in the direction that his fur is growing so that it looks more natural. We don't want the fur growing all kind of crazy ways. We try to stick with the same growth pattern of his fur, and I'm just really darkening up this shadow. But I'm doing it with brush strokes, just tiny little hair-like brush strokes right over that dark shadow color, and right away you start seeing the texture. We're going to get some more of the darker areas in, and I'm just using the very tip of my brush here so that some of those brush strokes are really thin. You could also switch to a smaller brush, but I am going to stick with this brush, and I am just trying to get into those darker shadow spots. I'm going to go across his paws down here, put in some of those shadows, but again, I'm doing it with brush strokes. Whereas at the very beginning, we just let them bleed together, just solid paint colors. Now I'm wanting to start to build up some texture. So I'm just going to put in those shadows around his paws, and I will be back shortly. I'm going to let you watch, and I will be right back. So once you get these strokes in, we're going to let this dry just a little bit, and we're going to come right back. Now through the magic of video, it's dry, and I'm mixing up more of a medium red brown, and I'm going to come back in here and start to darken up some of these lighter areas. There's too much of a contrast, and again, I told you at the beginning, we're just building up layers. We're building up the different values using our browns and just layering them over. I'm coming in with the same kind of darker brown and painting in some of the little shadow shapes I saw across his nose. Again, it's always good to look at your reference photo more than you actually look at your painting. So I've switched over to my detail brush because I want smaller little brush strokes to indicate the fur texture, and I'm coming in here with a little bit of the lighter brown over this lighter area. just to darken it up, but I still want to stay with that lighter brown. I don't want to come and get that dark brown and put in this area because I want this area to stay lighter. So I'm sticking with the same color, just a little bit darker version, a little bit more concentrated. The same color as that initial wash that we put on at the very beginning is what I mean. So you want to try to do the same colors in the same areas. If you want, like I want his muzzle to stay light, so I'm going to keep in using some of the lighter brown in that lighter area. I hope that makes sense. Like I'm not going to use the really dark brown all over that light area because it'll darken it up too much. I'm going to stay in the same value range, but just a tad bit darker for this. And as you layer, it gets a little darker too. So I'm just coming in here and darkening up some of these lighter areas. Again, like I said, had a little bit too much contrast. So I'm taking just really pale washes, really watery washes, going around his eye and across his cheeks there, just to sort of start to blend it in. And I'm going to continue to just add more texture and layer and deepen these shadows as I go. And I'm going to let you watch, and I shall be right back. So I went into my reddish brown, and I'm also making these little brush strokes to indicate fur right across his forehead where it's a little bit darker. Again, building up those shadows, building them up, and just a little bit lighter in this really highlighted area above his little eye on this left side, the right side of his face. And you can see how we're starting to build up those values. Now usually you would go light to dark, but I went straight into the dark with this one as far as the shadow. But normally you would work light to dark. But I just put those dark shadows in first, and now I'm building up the other shadows, the other parts, to blend in with those darker areas. That's not the way most people do their watercolors, so if you want to go light to dark, then do that. You'll just have to change your layering. So now I've got a little bit of pink here, and I've mixed it with my brown for his little claws, the quick part of his claws. And I'm just putting it in there, just randomly into each one of his little claws. And now I am going to darken up his paws and add some more shadows. And of course I'm doing it with my smaller detail brush, doing a lot more texture in there. And I'll let you watch, and I shall return just shortly. So I've pretty much painted in his paws, got the shadows in there. It's still wet, so I'm adding a little bit more of my darker color in where the shadows are so it'll bleed nicely, blend in nicely. And I'm trying to pay attention to where the really darks are so that I get that right. That's one of the most important things of making something look realistic and three-dimensional, is to get the shadows and the highlights and the midtones correct, or at least convincing. Let's put it that way. They don't have to be 100% correct. They just have to be convincing. So I'm painting in around his little claws. Now I've let that dry completely, and I am coming in with some greens on this little tree branch that he's hanging on to. And you see I'm leaving some of the white of the paper shining through. Then I'm going to come in with a brown mixture while that green is still wet and just drop it in there. Let it blend naturally on the surface of the paper. Same thing on the other side of the branch. We are just going to put in that olivey green color, leaving some of the white of the paper shining through. And then we are going to come in with some more dark colors and just go in there and drop that in so that it gives it a nice, almost a rough barky texture like bark. That's what we're going for, but we don't want it to be so defined. So that's what we're going to do there, and just trying to bring it up. So I don't want too much of the white of the paper shining right around his little body. So I came back in there and got that closer to his body. Now I'm going to darken up his nose, put a few more little details on there. He's got some shadows on his nose. His nose is too much the same value as the rest of his snout, and in the reference photo it is much darker, so we're going to darken that up a little bit. Now we're going to keep adding more to the shadows, darkening those up as we go. I'm darkening some of the shadows around his little eyes, and I'm just using that darker brown mixture. And I'm using my smaller detail brush and just sort of blending out those texture, that texture stroke I'm doing, that hair, furry texture that I'm doing. I'm just sort of blending it out as I go. And I'm trying to leave his little eyebrows paler. But at the end, we will do a unifying wash to bring everything together, so don't let it scare you. Every painting goes through that ugly duckling stage. Just keep going, have faith in the process, and you will be fine. You're going to have your cute little bear in no time. So I'm adding some more shadow work across his little muzzle here, his snout, and again, I'm using that pale reddish brown that we used from the beginning, but only it's more concentrated. I have less water in it, more paint. That makes a better shadow color. Now I'm just coming in here and I am adding washes of the two different browns, the red brown and that darker brown, over his paws. And in some areas I am darkening up the shadows with a little bit of the really dark brown, as you can see there. And that starts to bring his little paws out. And I'm going to take a medium brown wash and go over his forehead, and that unifies some of that color in there. It also helps unify those brush marks so that they're not so bold and look so, like they're just standing out from the paper. It blends them down into the paper. So we're going to take this reddish brown and just do a wash over his whole little face. And that helps to unify his fur and his shadows together. He is starting to look so cute. I'm loving him. He is the cutest little bear. Now his claws, we're going to have to work on those too. We'll get to that shortly. But right now I'm just trying to get in those shadows and do some washes to unify some of the areas so that he is not looking so disjointed. He's a lot less disjointed now that we did that nice brownish red, reddish brown wash. So now I am making a really darker color coming in here. His ears have a really deep shadow. And again, I am trying to make my brush strokes mimic the way that his fur is growing in the right direction, and just getting in some little darker details there. Okay, we are just putting in a little bit of sort of a pale brownish color into those claws. We're going to let this dry completely, and then we're going to move on. So now it is dry through the magic of video, and I'm taking a little bit of white gouache, and I'm just going in over. I've watered it down some so that it's a little bit transparent, but still opaque enough to show up as white. And I am just adding those claws in there, but I'm leaving some of the pink of the quick to shine through. Take some of that gouache and mix it with my reddish brown, and I'm just going to add some little highlights, some little tiny fur details around his muzzle, using my detail, and some in other areas, just adding a little bit of highlights. And what I did again was just mix some of that white gouache with the brown that I've been using. I'm going to let you watch, and I shall return shortly. So I'm just finishing up some of these highlights here around his little nose, around his eyes, with that pale brown gouache and watercolor mixture. And once I get that done, we're going to finish off the tree. It has dried now. All of that green and brown is dried, and it's looking really pretty. Let me just add just a little bit more of a little darker version of this gouache so that his claws are not just so white. So we just tone those down just a touch. And now we are going to come back in, and I'm taking a little bit of blue, and I'm just going to add that blue to the tree, especially around the bear, so that it's like the cast shadow from the bear. Once we get that in there, that will look much better. Again, I'm using that same technique where I'm not covering the whole paper with that blue. I'm putting it in sort of streaks and letting some of the undercolors shine through in spots so that it's not just a solid blue wash. And that is gray in that green and brown down some, making it look a little bit more like an actual wooden, actual tree, and not so green. I'm also coming in and adding some of the green in while it's still wet in some of the spots, and some of the brown as well as the blue. And I'm just letting those mix and mingle, wet on wet. I'm going to come back and add a few more brown details, just some like texture marks while it's wet so that they will bleed together, and it'll make, a tree that's sort of convincing. Okay, then once you get all this in there, you are going to let it dry and you will have the cutest little bear. You can add a sky if you want. I'm not adding a sky. I am just going to leave it as is. And I hope you have enjoyed this. Please hit the subscribe button if you enjoyed it. Share it with a friend, and I shall see you on Monday.